Welcome back to another episode of the Return of the Roar Sacramento Kings podcast on Sactown Sports 1140. My name is Brenden Nunes. No Frankie Cardicelli, just had a little child, and little did he know he maybe saw his last game as De'Aaron Fox as a member of the Sacramento Kings. I do have Chris Watkins here, coworker friend of mine. What's going on, Chris? How you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. There's as you just kind of alluded to, a lot going on right now in King circles, and you and I, and in life too. Full disclosure, I guess we should say that you and I wanted to record. Actually, we wanted to record two podcasts last week, but both of us got sick and couldn't really make it happen. And I think this is feeling like the right time for all of this to be put on record. So I guess in a weird way, it ended up working out for the best. But I'm doing all right, doing a lot better than I was last week. And man, I don't know. It feels like every Kings. Anybody who's following the Kings really at all, whether you're a fan or just an NBA supporter or whatever, just a casual viewer, I think everybody is just kind of minute by minute, hour by hour at this point with how their emotions are, because it's what, we're 7-8 days away from the NBA trade deadline, and here in Sacramento, I think is kind of the epicenter of it all right now.
We are 1 week away from the NBA trade deadline at the time of recording. And like you said, you and I were pretty sick last week, which made it a little bit tough. But here now, and plenty to talk about. Yesterday, which I'm not a day of the week guy, which is I guess that's a thing. Wednesday, yesterday, I'm not a day of the week guy. It makes no difference to me.
I'm assuming you mean you don't know what day of the week it is,
Yeah.
you don't subscribe to the days of the week.
Well, it's all just made up.
Time's
anyway.
a construct, brother.
Exactly.
I get it.
Exactly. Like, I call them whatever days I want. We're
Right.
gonna rework the whole.
It's a day that ends with an Y.
It is. Once the Mayan calendar passed 2020 or whatever,
That's
I
right.
unsubscribed.
Happy Lunar New Year, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I've been celebrating.
Yeah. Yes.
Yesterday, Wednesday, De'Aaron Fox. It is reported. Eventually comes out nationally that the Kings are entertaining trade conversations for De'Aaron Fox. To start, I'll say I don't think it's the most surprising thing for them to be entertaining Fox this offseason at Rich Paul that, hey, I want to see what direction this organization is going in before I'm willing to commit long-term. Turn down an extension, which any player would have turned down because he has supermax eligibility throughout this season. I think part of the timing of all of this, as was kind of hearing this unfold before it eventually got super public, has to do with, it's pretty obvious. We all know, we've known for 2 years that the Kings need to make another trade to get a wing forward on this roster if they're going to propel themselves to the next level of whatever caliber of contention you want to say in the Western Conference. I think flirting with second round, and being competitive when you got to that point. We've known that they need a wing and forward. And it sounded like, by the way, they had a John Collins trade just like fully lined up, ready to go. A week ago, I forget what day, there was a day where, you fully made a graphic. We thought, okay, John Collins might be on the Kings by the end of today, tomorrow, whatever it was, about a week ago. That trade doesn't end up happening. I think that got to the point where they were even telling some players and things like that.
Anyone watching video, there's the video.
Yeah, anybody watching. By the way, on the YouTube side, always for the pods.
Hey.
A little video, and always appreciate comments on there as well. So thanks to everybody listening on whatever platform. But essentially, the team reached a point where they were getting phone calls about De'Aaron Fox that they thought were at least somewhat interesting. And so they went to Rich Paul, and therefore De'Aaron, obviously, and said, hey, where are you guys at? Because we have these offers here. We're wondering if we should be considering them more seriously, essentially. And I think there was a level of, sort of offense taken to that of, you're really going to entertain this before you go and try and get me some help, is I think where this all stems from. That's my read on all of this, is that there's a sense of, damn, you're really going to try to trade me before you go and make these moves that you're telling us are already lined up, that it's been known for a year and a half that we need to do something ever since they were trending correct direction. First year of Mike Brown, 3 seed, don't get out of the first round in that one, but you have a highly competitive 7-round series against what are at that point the defending champion Warriors. De'Aaron Fox also really liked Mike Brown, advocated for him to stick around this offseason when those contract extensions were going on. And Mike eventually does stick around, only to be fired in the middle of this season. And De'Aaron Fox makes comments about how in the offseason, he was talking about how he appreciated the continuity that this team was starting to have. And a lot of that had to do with Mike Brown. And then they decided to move on. And I think that the writing was on the wall from that point, but there was still a level of, all right, let's see if they're going to make a move, because De'Aaron likes Doug Christie, from my understanding still. It's no, just because he loved Mike doesn't mean that he doesn't like Doug. I think there's still a level of faith there to an extent. But it seems like he is losing faith in this organization to continue to propel them in the right direction, continue trending upwards. And I think that as the gardeners in the back decide to go crazy, I don't know if you can hear that.
It's all good. Just a little.
And the rumored destination that he has in mind, which is often going to be the case in a lot of these scenarios, specifically regarding Rich Paul and just high-profile NBA players often get to have some sort of control in where they may end up, is the San Antonio Spurs. And we've heard all the same things. The San Antonio is the place he wants to go to. And I think that being the organization, one of the most stable and probably trustworthy NBA organizations that exist in the league, being the one he wants to go to rather than a, New York, LA, some market or something, that is a basketball centered decision. And I don't think there's two ways about it. Like Wembanyama obviously playing a big part there, but it could not be a more polar opposite organization than the Sacramento Kings. I think that a lot of this just stems from losing faith from Fox's standpoint in the Kings being able to do something. And hey, I'd like to be on an organization I could actually trust.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I definitely think that's a big part of it, is just like you said. I mean, I don't know if I would say it's the polar opposite, because they're both small markets and things like that. I would almost say that it's like the like the Superman Bizarro. It's like they are what the Kings want to be, and not that that's necessarily even what Superman Bizarro is, but it's just, the Golden State, San Antonio is the gold standard of what it is to be a small market in this league. Like you laid out, I mean, they never let the fact that they're the least popular Texas city to have an NBA team stop them from having the best dynasty, the best run of all of those teams. I think that San Antonio definitely represents probably what he wished would happen here in Sacramento, because I think something that's definitely gotten twisted up, and I think you did a great job of outlining kind of how we got here with De'Aaron and the team. It's it's just funny that these guys, I think De'Aaron wanted to stay here. De'Aaron wants to be a Sacramento King. I think that's really important to highlight, is that if De'Aaron Fox had his way, I honestly do think he would stay in Sacramento for the rest of his career. However, the organization, as we know, is not buttoned up. And I think that's what he sees in San Antonio is, hey, like you said, De'Aaron's not a big city guy. How many times he hates his least favorite arena to play in, he has publicly stated, is Madison Square Garden. Okay, this is not a guy who yearns for the spotlight, and I think San Antonio represents that. He gets to stay in the spotlight for sure. He'll be with Wemby. They'll still be talked about. But at the same time, he's not going to be in LA. He's not going to be in Chicago. He's not going to be in New York. He's not going to be even, who knows, Miami is still a destination or a name on the list, but even Miami's got a certain amount of cachet to it. I think that San Antonio is just a much, much better, more idealized version of what De'Aaron was hoping Sacramento would turn into. And I think that's really the telling thing about this is, to me, again, like, this didn't have to happen. And again, I was telling you yesterday that I kind of, my sister was a little confused on the order of operations of everything. And I kind of listed out exactly how you just framed it. Like, This all started from De'Aaron Fox going to management, or I guess Rich Paul going to having that meeting with the Kings front office and saying, I would like this team to get better, and if this team gets better, I will resign. I will not resign until I see that said improvement. Seems very logical. And then to go on and for the team to say, maybe instead of improving, we should look to trade De'Aaron. It's just, you're worried about the wrong thing. Like, again, imagine from De'Aaron Fox's perspective of all of this, he's saying, how is this how we ended up here? How did we end up here? How did we get to the point where I ask you, hey, can you go trade Kevin Huerter for me, please? Just swap that out. Swap that piece out for something better. And they come back to him and say, you know how you told us to go look for a trade for Kevin Huerter? How do you feel about maybe what if we trade you? And imagine internalizing that and saying, how is that the conversation that you come back to me with? And so it's just it's really confusing. It's been a weird month and a half if you throw in the Mike Brown stuff on top of it as well. I don't know. To me, it really is just pointing back at the level of dysfunction that's going on, because it's just insane that this team goes from, extending Mike Brown in the offseason, potentially signing De'Aaron Fox to a long-term extension, to now Mike Brown's out the building and De'Aaron Fox very well might be right behind him. And I think the question for most Kings fans that we kind of have to get to next is, if De'Aaron's gone, what does that mean for everything else? Malik Monk just signs this offseason. Keegan Murray, is he going to be here in the future? DeMar DeRozan made comments earlier today about his future and essentially being uncertain on what he's going to do if the direction of this team isn't to ascend upwards. Domantas Sabonis, he just signed a long-term deal. Is he going to want to stick around? Is he going to be the thing that this team builds around? And if it is, are you trying to win now? Again, that's the thing that's being worked out right now in the trade talks. A lot of people saying the Kings want win now players and draft picks. I have no idea what direction this team is going in terms of where it's actually going to go. I think obviously whatever move they make, they're going to feel like it's sending them in the right direction. But it's just hard to think that you trade De'Aaron Fox and then things either get increasingly better or you just automatically go to the tank. It just feels like this team is going to make this move and then end up right back into limbo.
Yeah, it's very rare that a team is trading away a star and then also looking to remain competitive, which makes the return, any potential deal that we're talking about, a little bit more complicated. But before we get to like potential life after Fox in Sacramento, I guess, I feel like there's a little bit of a split among Kings fans of how much they understand where De'Aaron's coming from compared to, blaming him also throughout this process. And I think it's a balance of both. I'll say I've always been a little bit more of a De'Aaron defender. I think he's the best player on this team. I don't think it's that close personally when it comes to just needing a 1A on a team. And I think that for what it's worth, that hurts way more in the postseason than it does in the regular season. I feel like a lot of people are talking about regular season production. That's fine. Look what he did in that 7-game series against the Warriors. And you need that sort of guy on your roster if you're going to seriously compete for anything. And just to go back down the line, like nobody understands Sacramento's dysfunction as an organization more than longtime loyal Kings fans, which even predates me. It would be more so you. But go back to, they whiffed the Marvin Bagley draft, right? In the 12th pick in 2020, they take Tyrese Halliburton. They take a guard, right? That was the obvious pick at the time, whatever about that. 2021, they take Davion Mitchell, 9th. They take another guard in the lottery. Again, just think about this as from Fox's perspective. How would you feel, right? Number 4, they take, or in 2022, they take Keegan Murray. Great. This last year, they don't have a pick in 2023. They traded away to essentially re-sign Domantas Sabonis long-term, trade away the pick along with Rashawn Holmes, free up money, blah, blah, blah. 2024, with a 13th pick, you take Devin Carter, another guard that, there's more wings on the table. And there's been years in the past where the Kyle Kuzma trade, my understanding is I think De'Aaron kind of liked Kyle Kuzma and the idea of that. We all thought that trade was going to happen, to the point where it was damn near reported that it was going to happen. This is a couple years ago. It's the Buddy Hield deal. That doesn't end up taking place. And that's just one of the ones that we hear about. The John Collins one that's going on throughout the course of this year. I think there's a handful of scenarios throughout the years where almost deals happen, and the players will hear about that even more so than obviously what ends up getting reported. And I just think the fact that as a fan, you're frustrated with the Kings is, I think, 1,000% understandable. And just my perspective on it is, if you're a player where your livelihood is even more affected by that, then the frustration is amplified, So no, De'Aaron Fox isn't a Luka Doncic. He's not a Giannis. He's not a Wemby. He's not good enough to be the only guy on a team and make them competitive by himself. And that's fine. There's 6, 7, 8 of those guys maybe in the league. I think he's kind of in that next tier, and I think there's, in his own mind, he could talk himself into thinking, I'm not that far off from SGA, which, argue that what you want, but I think that in his mind, it's easy to talk yourself into that. Hey, if I actually had things around me, this would look a lot different. My legacy would be way different. And I think that just that's the point that we've reached. Like I said earlier, frustration with the organization, a lack of trust that they are going to put him in a spot over this next, what's going to be his third contract, and take him through a majority of his prime. He's 27, 28, 1 year left. And then the next deal is going to be his prime. And he's also a uber athletic point guard who we've seen a lot of those guys fizzle out very quickly. Now, it seems like he's trying to go a little bit more of the Mike Conley route, of becoming a better defender, becoming a better shooter. Maybe it'll progress more kind late in his later years. But there's also the John Walls, where this all ends very quickly, So I think it's understandable from his perspective to be over it. But no, he's not good enough to be a number one and just turn everything around by himself. And I think that's fine. That's just the caliber of player that we're talking about here. But now the Kings have to figure out the hardest part of the team building process is finding that 1A. And if you move on from De'Aaron Fox, which, by the way, it sounds like he might end up in San Antonio before the deadline. Like, it seems like things are pointing towards this is probably going to get done. Yep. Now, that's not that this can't be salvaged. There's still a world where he makes all NBA and gets supermax money. I think that is very unlikely. Yeah, I think it's extremely unlikely. And I think the fact that we're at this point where these reportings are coming out via Rich Paul and other places points towards they also feel like it's pretty unlikely at this point, because that was, I think, one of the big pluses for potentially remaining in Sacramento is I can get so much more money than I could anywhere else as long as I make supermax. I feel like all of this getting to this point means that they also feel like that's probably not happening this season. So, like I said, you're resetting the hardest part of the team building process is finding that 1A. And in any potential deal, the one people would like to point to a lot, and I've seen referenced a lot over the last few days as well, OKC traded Paul George and they got SGA. The couple things I would say there is Paul George was an MVP candidate at that time in OKC. And that's just kind of the outlier. It's very rare that you are legitimately getting. Nobody thought SGA was going to be flirting with MVP.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was like, SGA was a good young piece, but to my recollection, and I do remember SGA being really good on that Clippers team for that one season, but I don't know how much different, like in terms of the perception, I don't know how much different Stephon Castle is from SGA right now.
Right. And I think that's where we're at. And if you look back at some of the recent deals, James Harden was an expiring contract, and this is during the offseason, so 1 full year remaining. He gets traded for a bunch of salary matching pieces, Marcus Morris, Rocco, Batum, KJ Martin, but then 3 first-round picks, 2024, 2026, 2028 from the Clippers, a swap in 2029, and 3 seconds, right? Salary match, 3 firsts, a swap, 3 seconds. Damian Lillard, 2 years remaining. And I think this is one of the most comparable scenarios because he was very much saying, hey, I want to go to Miami.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it was very well known also, like in terms of a leverage standpoint, not much leverage to the team that's trading him.
Right. And why that leverage matters is, sure, the Kings can still trade him wherever they want, but the team is only going to, on the other side, is only going to be willing to give up so much if they are getting messaging from Rich Paul, De'Aaron Fox that, hey, I'm not going to re-sign here. This is exactly what's going on with Jimmy Butler, right? And why these other teams, why he's saying, I don't want to go to Memphis. And I think that's also why Sacramento is part of that, growing into part of that list, because, hey, I don't know that they want to pay me, and I don't know that I want to re-sign here in the first place. So that's the control that De'Aaron has in throughout this scenario. But Damian Lillard eventually said that he was fine with Milwaukee, which was part of this, but he had 2 years remaining on his deal. He was traded for DeAndre Ayton, Alvin Kamara, Drew Holiday, a 2029 first, and first-round pick swaps in 2028 and 2030. So really, DeAndre Ayton, Alvin Kamara, Drew Holiday, a first-round pick, and 2 first-round swaps. And then obviously they eventually flipped Drew Holiday for...
Which was part of the understanding at that time as well. Like, that was baked into the value.
Right. Which is where it's a little different for the Kings. If you're the Kings and you get, let's just say, that exact deal, you keep all those players, because this is not an organization that wants to reset. I think we've been given no indication to think that they want to fully tear this down, that if they move on from De'Aaron Fox, that means they're going to trade DeMar DeRozan and Domantas Sabonis, Malik Monk, whatever. I don't think that's the case at all. I think this team wants to remain competitive, which is where you reach this weird juggle, right? And specifically with him trying to be like, hey, I want it to be San Antonio. The Spurs have to think that De'Aaron is the right guy for next to Wemby, because they can be a little bit more patient here. I know we're in year 2 of Wemby and already getting are the Spurs good enough? Is he going to go somewhere else? I think that's all BS. But the Spurs can be patient enough to pick the right guy. So they have to also think that De'Aaron is the right guy here. And I think that they may feel that way. And there's even talks about, like, could they get De'Aaron and somebody else at this deadline and really try to accelerate this timeline, for example. But Stephon Castle sitting there. You got Devin Vassell on this roster as well. You could, Chris Paul matching salary aspect, Keldon Johnson sitting there. If we're talking about a potential deal, obviously Castle would be the coveted piece. I want to say he was just the 4th pick in the draft. He's top of the rookie ladders right now. I think also the name, by the way, Kings need their Castle. There's something there, something fun going on there somewhere. But I've heard people float around like, I think they could get Stephon Castle and Devin Vassell and picks. And that's hard for me to imagine. I don't know if we're talking about Stephon Castle in this deal. I think it might be a little bit more Devin Vassell, Keldon Johnson, and 2-3 first-round picks, for example. And they have some interesting picks. They have an Atlanta unprotected pick from this season that is currently sitting at 11th. The Kings are sitting at 12th with their pick, by the way. You have a unprotected Atlanta pick in 2027. There's swaps in 2026 in there. You don't know what direction the Hawks are going to go in. That we could very much have a Trae Young conversation that we're having with De'Aaron Fox in a year or two. So interesting draft capital there as well. But how would you feel about a De'Aaron Fox for Vassell, Keldon Johnson, and say 2-3 first-round picks?
I wouldn't love it. I'll tell you that. I from a Kings perspective, feel like I need Stephon Castle in this deal in order to sell a fan base, because frankly, that's part of it too, is if you're trading your franchise player, and then now here's the funny thing. If the Kings have a press conference after they make this move, you can't then tell your fan base like, well, of course they wouldn't say it, but you couldn't essentially walk in front of them, say, hey, look how great we did, look at this return, and then not take their, obviously you're not getting Victor Wembanyama, but their next best asset. I mean, that's a pretty tough sell from a GM who's already made, and I guess now we have to lump not just GM but assistant GM into that as well. But you can't have that to show for it. You can't. That's weak negotiating. First and foremost, like, again, you can't say, we really tried to get Stephon Castle, but this is the only way we can get it done. Like, the Kings need to hold some sort of, we are trading the best player in this deal, no matter what. It doesn't, unless obviously Victor Wembanyama is not involved, but like, we need to get something to show for this, and to get, frankly, Devin Vassell, who is on the Spurs, a high level role player, as your shining piece. I don't know. I feel like some of the Kings PTSD might be coming back, but that feels a little Buddy Hield for DeMarcus Cousins-ish. And I just feel like, looking back especially, like, you need to get some sort of piece to have. Like, even in that Damian Lillard trade, DeAndre Ayton was the number one pick in the draft above Marvin Bagley. Like, we knew that he wasn't to that caliber by the time he was traded, but he had still been on an NBA Finals run with Phoenix. People still had, real hope that DeAndre Ayton can turn into something. The Kings have to have something to show. And to me, Devin Vassell, who's already on his rookie extension contract, $30 million a year, pretty much. I think he's $27 million a year Devin Vassell is going to be making for the next 4 years. That's not very enticing to me. Now, maybe if the Kings really are a lot more win now than what I'm giving them credit for, then I guess they can justify it. But to me, there's no way you can make that deal without having Stephon Castle. And even if that means you're getting less first-round picks in return, I think you have to do it, because I think you just have to have something to show for trading De'Aaron Fox. And I just don't think that Devin Vassell, who would be, I don't know, I guess at best the Kings' third best player on this team, I would probably more guess like fourth or fifth. Like, I just kind of feel like that's not a good enough return when you're trading a franchise piece. And I think you would get absolutely crucified for it. I think you need to try and get both, but to me, you have to get Stephon Castle in return.
Yeah, which I think is fair. I'm a big Devin Vassell guy. You look at his numbers last year: 19.5 a game, 37% from three, 47% from two. Funnily enough, he's one of the few mid-range guys, like new age mid-range guys in the NBA. Right. And obviously, De'Aaron, DeMar, the Kings seem to be kind of the kings of that throughout their recent history. I think he's interesting. He's dealt with some injuries this year that make his numbers this season a little bit weird to sort of dive into, but let's just go down that potential path. Say it is Castle and Vassell. Let's just go best case scenario real quick. So you're working with a starting group of, assumedly, Stephon Castle, Malik Monk, Keegan Murray, DeMar DeRozan, Domantas Sabonis. On your bench, you have Devin Vassell, you have Devin Carter, you have Keon Ellis, Trey Lyles is still there. Did I mention Kevin Huerter? I guess Kevin still Huerter's on this still roster. There. Like, how much? They're a lot worse, right? Like, notably, and again, I think it hurts more in the postseason. Is where I think the long-term view of this team I have less faith in. Regular season, they could still probably float around 500 where they're at, and you feel okay, but you still have the same problem of not enough wings forwards, even when you add Devin Vassell to this team. It feels, I don't know what to make of, because put out like a Q&A thing right before this, and a lot of people like, well, are they still going to move on from Kevin Huerter, Trey Lyles, blah, blah, blah. I think this makes this weird. Like, I don't really know. Priority one is moving on from De'Aaron Fox, assuming that that's the direction we're going in. And I don't think this is past the point of any potential saving, but it's very unlikely. Again, everything I've got, I think he's going to be probably in San Antonio by the end of a week, by the deadline. What do you do at that point? Like, what is your direction as a franchise? And I think that's the question with the Kevin Huerter and Trey Lyles. Like, right now it was assumed, hey, we're still trying to be competitive right now, so let's do a John Collins. Let's do a Cam Johnson, which, by the way, they were just in New York for 4 days. I think that's part of why this got to this point, the John Collins thing kind of sitting there. But, hey, we're still going to try on Cam Johnson. And then they get 4 days in New York while playing the Knicks and then the Nets with some days in between. Kevin Huerter gets his jersey retired at high school. They were in New York for a while with an opportunity to talk to Brooklyn's front office. Monty McNair was on the trip. And I think that's how it got to this point, is that, hey, we're probably out on Cam at this point, or maybe that needs to be revisited. And instead, we're getting calls on De'Aaron. Maybe we're going to explore this direction. What do you do? What do you do if you do make that Spurs trade? Do you still try and go move on from Kevin Huerter and potentially Trey Lyles? Trey Lyles more lumped into this just because salary matching purposes rather than, hey, we need to get rid of Trey Lyles. I think in the same way that Kevin Huerter's gotten to that point, obviously getting a DNP CD for the first time since coming to Sacramento 2.5 years ago. Do you still try and go trade those pieces for another wing forward in the more immediate, for a more immediate impact?
Personally, I wouldn't, because I think you're already kind of signaling that you're I don't know, you're not serious about winning a playoff series this season or next season. So I personally would feel like, hey, John Collins, if the Kings don't trade for him now, like, is John Collins going to get traded by the end of the week? Like, I feel like he'll probably still be available in the offseason. You could revisit it at that time. But to me, I wouldn't get the point. I mean, again, you could almost say that would add to the frustration, right? You trade De'Aaron Fox and then you go and make the John Collins deal then. Like, it is almost a little bit back to the Mike Brown situation of order of operations. Like, I feel like you should probably try and improve the actual on the floor team first, and then let those other decisions fall in after you've legitimately tried to make the situation better. But I guess with how things have gone, I guess that is the thing that would make the most sense, is the thing that seems to make the least amount of sense. That's what I would do. I personally wouldn't, but again, with how things have gone, I do kind of think that they would almost, I don't want to say be forced, but again, you still have DeMar, you still have Domas, you still have Malik, you still have this core of guys that's going to be trying to win games and is good enough to at least compete. I mean, we saw them play a couple games there without De'Aaron Fox, and they looked pretty good, and that was only for a couple of games, but I think it shows that, hey, yeah, you throw Stephon Castle, you throw Devin Vassell in there, maybe they could be pretty competitive for the rest of this season, which is fine. But what is that getting you? What direction are you going? And I think this is tying back to what we talked about after they let go of Mike Brown. Are you doing these things with a clear direction in mind, or are you just taking things as they go day by day? That is the thing that is incredibly unclear. And as the days go by, it feels like the clarity is they seem to be taking things day by day and do not have some grand end of the rainbow plan that they're all heading towards. It feels like they're just taking blows and reacting as according. And I don't know. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a long way of saying I don't know, but I think based off of how they've operated, I would guess that it's not off the table that they probably would still make that move and try and improve it and just say, hey, we're still in a talent acquisition phase, and we think that, this is a good move for us, and we decided to strike while we thought it was the right time. But I don't know. To me, it wouldn't make sense. If I were running the team and I'm trading my franchise player at that point, that's waving the white flag, and all of my next moves would be in the name of trying to get that rebuild as solidified and as done as quickly as possible, because there is a way that they could reset. Like we always talk about, rebuild or reset. If you trade De'Aaron Fox for, let's just use the Stephon Castle, Devin Vassell, and yeah, let's say those 2 Atlanta picks, the one this year, and then we'll say the one in 2027, you could realistically turn this thing around with Vassell, Castle, what you said, the 11 and 2 top 10 picks on top of that. Right. I think that is a pretty decent formula to get 4 younger players in the building within 6 months. And who knows? Yeah, during the offseason, if DeMar DeRozan wants to be moved, you can get him for more pieces. I don't think Domantas Sabonis would want to be moved. He seems to, just from afar, he seems to be very okay with a lot of these things going on. I wonder if Malik Monk. Doug Christie guy, exactly. That's more so what I mean, not Sabonis versus Fox kind of stuff. But I just wonder if maybe that's the more logical thing. But I mean, again, long story short, I really don't know, because they've just been so unpredictable with all of this. How do you feel?
Yeah, I think you lined it out well. If it's me, I'm fully resetting. I don't think that they go in that direction at all. I get why it's complicated given the history of the Kings, and I think it's admirable to want to remain competitive, but I think sometimes you got to look big picture. And I agree with you. Like, resetting this year, you could end up with some pretty good draft picks. And I never thought that this would be the conversation we're having at the beginning of the year. If you had told me Mike Brown and De'Aaron Fox aren't in this team by the trade deadline, I would say that you're crazy. But I'd also say, hey, this is the Sacramento.
Sure.
And I think the other weird aspect here is I thought the writing was on the wall for De'Aaron, barring him making All NBA when they moved on from Mike Brown. I think that was, we were leading up to that point, right, of an eventual offseason trade. I also thought there was a good chance that this front office wasn't going to make it through the offseason, and that their hiring process for the new front office was going to be, hey, pitch me what you would do in a potential De'Aaron Fox trade. And now, if you're doing it by the deadline, is this the front office you even trust to be trading De'Aaron Fox? And if you do move on from them this offseason after letting them trade De'Aaron Fox, next guy's coming in like, hey, I didn't even get to build any of this. Like, we already have a direction. And what does that mean for them? I also don't get to pick my head coach. And I felt like part of the 17-year drought was that the front office and head coach was never on the same page. Front office was never picking the head coach. When they did pick a new one, front office would eventually get fired. New head coach or new front office comes in with a head coach that's already in place, and eventually repeat the cycle all over again. And I'm worried that we're getting back to that here, because a lot of this happened because of this front office. Even just little things like not holding a press conference is like just a little cherry on top of, from Fox's perspective, God, this organization is like borderline incompetent. He got a lot of crap for the Mike Brown firing, to the point where he had to come out publicly. He didn't have to, but felt a need to, and say, hey, I didn't have anything to do with this. If they have a press conference, none of that happens, and they can say that this is all us. We decided to go in this direction. We know De'Aaron Fox had nothing to do with this, but he had to take the brunt of that. And that's not the main thing here, but it's just another piece on top of, can I really trust this organization? And it wouldn't surprise me if ownership is at the same point. And obviously ownership is part of this, but does ownership trust the front office at this point when they're putting them in these weird situations and there's all this drama? Like, this is messy. I think that they probably do try to move on from Kevin Huerter still before the deadline as well. It'd be insane if Kevin Huerter lasts on this team longer than De'Aaron Fox, but I do think that is a real possibility here, and part of the reason that we're at the point that we are at. So just a weird one all around. I don't really know what other direction to necessarily go in. What else? Anything else come to your mind that you feel like we need to check off here on this?
No, but I mean, I do think it's important, as you kind of mentioned, ownership there, and it's something we've talked about before. I think, again, as all things seem to be stemming back to the Mike Brown firing, I remember talking about in that podcast after, this is the kind of thing that creates factions within your locker room, and from things that I've heard, I'm not going to say that it's like a high school and, these people sit at this table and these people sit at this table. But from things that I have heard is that there are lines starting to get drawn, and there are people kind of not picking sides, but, there are people who have their beliefs, and there are some people who have these beliefs. And I think, I don't know. It just seems like there's a lot going on in the background of people trying to salvage it, but also people who are actively trying to make this happen. And I think there's a lot of different cooks in the kitchen, and that's always been the case in Sacramento. And it is dysfunction, and it leads to dysfunction. And I think I don't know. I'm just really curious how all of this is going to play out. And then, like you mentioned, kind of with the GM stuff, I think that's the most important part of all of this, because just like you laid out, like if Monty McNair and Wes Wilcox are going to be the ones that are getting the return for De'Aaron Fox, any GM who walks in is kind of already at a disadvantage because they could say like, oh wow, like I would have gotten more for even if that's the best that could have offered. Like no matter what, they're going to be kind of put in a weird situation. So I don't know. I think I don't know if I really just said anything, but it's just there's a lot going on in the background, and it feels like to me that this is not. Here's what I'll say. This across the board is not a universal yes. This is not everybody is 100% all pulling on the same string. To me, it is seeming as if that there are some people who can make decisions that are not super happy with how all of this has gone down.
Agreed. I know people absolutely love when I bring up Mike Brown being right about things. But I think that the horizontal and vertical alignment that you pointed out right after he got fired, that he mentioned in his introductory presser about that being an important thing for changing the culture, I think he was right. And I think that we are so far from that alignment right now. There's the Fox's side of what they want in a potential scenario moving forward, which is very clearly to go to San Antonio, probably within the week. There's ownership, who I think really likes De'Aaron Fox and probably would prefer him to not go somewhere. There's the front office that is trying to save their jobs, and I think they're reasonable for exploring trades here. The issue is that, like, hey, you probably like you said, lots of cooks in the kitchen, pulling in different directions, makes it hard to believe like what is going to happen here. But I think the clear facts are that De'Aaron Fox is over it, I think is the best way to say it. It's not that he's requested a trade. It's that, hey, it's just being over it. And I think it's a very similar way that a lot of Kings fans are over it at this point. There's a lack of faith that this is going to continue trending in one way. And
again, please say De'Aaron Fox did not request a trade.
Right. Never happened. Never happened. And, you know, I think that the current recent reportings are practically doing that. But it's really just like we know that the writing's on the wall. If it's not this deadline, it's the off season. And from the front office perspective, you probably want to do it right now because you're going to get more value, you would assume, right now than you would at the trade at the come this off season when he still has another half season, meaning the remainder of this year, that would be factored into any potential deal if you move him before the deadline. It probably makes sense from their perspective to do it right now. Yeah. But I think that's one of the facts we know. And the other thing is that we know that this team doesn't want to reset. Like, they want to try and remain competitive. And while we laid out why we think we would fully reset if it was up to us, I think that they can be okay in a potential deal here. Like, there's a world where this works out in their favor. Again, I like I said, I still stand on the finding the 1A, which I think De'Aaron is, and nobody else is that close right now. Maybe DeMar, I guess you would say. And Malik Monk, I think, belongs in the conversation. I think a lot of people believe, okay, Malik can just step into the point guard role. I'm not as confident. I think there's a reason he's been a six man for most of his career, and he is very inconsistent. And when you're looking at him with the pressure and expectations that you put on Fox, that you might feel a lot different than the role that he's in right now, where when he drops 25, you're like, oh, that's great. You know, it's going to get to a scenario where like you expect 25 from De'Aaron every single night. And so that's where it gets a little different. But I think that they can end up in an okay scenario at the end of all of this. I think you can reclaim a lot of draft capital that you can try to mess with in the future. Maybe you end up trading DeMar DeRozan at the come this offseason and you try to recoup something there. Hopefully you're the Spurs rather than the Bulls in a potential DeRozan deal where, you know, Bulls got Chris Duarte in a second round pick or whatever. But I think you could end up okay, and you're not going to get your SGA more likely than not. But sure, there's a world where Stephon Castle turns into your equivalent of SGA, not same player, but who knows, right? And the draft capital in here as well. Obviously, the big thing, like we mentioned, you could get your 2031 swap back and say you got some Atlanta lottery this year, even in an Atlanta pick. Like, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I guess I would say. I don't think they're just going to be a total dumpster fire if they move in this direction. Now, the whole, are you going to move on from front office? That's its own thing, right? But when it comes to just what talent you have on the roster and how you can continue to move forward, I think that they can remain as competitive as they seem to want, while being realistic that we're not talking championship in any sort of way. We're not talking Western Conference Finals. So, it wouldn't surprise me. I guess what I'm saying is if a deal was made and then they still had a fun end to their season where they were competitive, they maybe even make it out of the play-in, have a fun first round, and things feel okay. I don't think that it's guaranteed doom and gloom just because you have to move on from De'Aaron Fox if we're at that point like we assume we are.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, again, we've seen this team be really competitive without De'Aaron Fox, and who knows? Like, it's a lot shorter of a sprint to ask Malik Monk, hey, can you kind of be the starting point guard for 25 games instead of 50 or 60 or 82. So yeah, who knows? Maybe there is a world in which, they make this move and it is adding depth which this team desperately needs. And Stephon Castle is a great player. Like, I don't think a lot of people have had the opportunity to watch him this year, but there's a reason why San Antonio wouldn't want to include him in a potential Fox trade. It's because he's a two-way player, like a true two-way player who makes just a ton of winning basketball plays. So it wouldn't surprise me if in a bigger role in a new situation he came in and did great. But, there's also the piece of this too. Doug Christie is still the head coach, and I love Doug, and Doug's done incredibly well so far this season. But this is also what I was concerned about is you make a move, and then you have this first-time head coach in a brand-new situation who's got to try and figure that out. And there's a bit more than just kind of vibes and setting the ship straight to get something like that to work, like to fully integrate two pieces potentially, and to try and and I know Jim Less was on the station yesterday, former King, UC Davis head coach, said if anybody's going to be able to manage the relationships of all of this, it's Doug Christie. 100% agree with that. But I just think that that's a pretty massive task to ask somebody who already has it just an unimaginable amount of stuff on their plate right now in Doug. So I don't know. It feels like a really, really big task. And I'm not saying it can't happen, but boy, oh boy, that just you're really stacking the deck against you.
And we're gonna reach an off season where Luke Lauk's probably gonna no longer be around. Is Jay Triano gonna be around? Luke Lauk's for sure gone. Jay Triano, like I would assume so. Probably damn near the whole coaching staff. Outside of Doug Christie. And then that's where you start to see, all right, what pool does he have around the league, which I think is a big question. We love Doug. I have a lot of respect for Doug. I think he's done a great job, like you said. But this, just reaffirms more of the public perception and I think league-wide perception of the Kings. And they're kanging.
That's a great point too.
Is really what's going on. So who's going to want to commit to this organization? And there's always there's only 30 jobs. So someone will do it, but you'd rather pick from, the more legitimate options rather than guys are doing it just because where else am I going to get an opportunity? So messy situation in Sacramento right now, obviously. And probably the end of De'Aaron Fox in Sacramento, which I didn't think we were going to get to this point this quickly. Things happen very fast in the NBA, and hopefully the Kings can get their castle and continue to trend in the right direction. But I think that's going to do it for us. Unless you got anything else here, kind of wrap this up and get out of here. So appreciate everybody listening, as always, to this episode of the Return of the Roar podcast, whether you're on any audio platforms or on the YouTube side. Likes, ratings, subscriptions, thumbs up, whatever, blah, blah, blah. All the stuff is always appreciated. Helps more than you guys realize. We also got plenty of great content on the written side, SactownSports.com, and on our radio shows, Sactown Sports 1140, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Covering all this, the chaos and mess that are the current Sacramento Kings. So we'll see how this next week continues to unfold. We'll have another pod for sure before the trade deadline. Keep you guys up to date with everything that we're hearing. So stay on the lookout for that. And yeah, like I said, appreciate everybody listening. Be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for future upcoming episodes.